The pickaxe struck stone, then empty air, and Sean Murphy felt his stomach lurch as the wall gave way beneath his hands. It was the summer of 1922, and the workmen renovating Leap Castle had grown accustomed to finding strange things within its walls. But nothing could have prepared them for what lay beyond that crumbling section of masonry beneath the bloody chapel. The smell hit them first. Not the musty odor of old stone or the dampness of Irish cellars, but something far worse. A thick, cloying stench of decay mixed with sulfur that seemed to coat the back of their throats and cling to their clothes. One worker vomited immediately. Another crossed himself and refused to continue. But Murphy, driven by a morbid curiosity he would later regret, held his lantern through the opening and peered into the darkness below. What he saw in that flickering light would haunt him until his final days. The oubliette, a word derived from the French meaning to forget, stretched downward into the earth like a throat waiting to swallow the unwary, and impaled upon wooden spikes that jutted upward from the floor were human remains. Not one skeleton, not two, but dozens upon dozens of bodies in various stages of decay, some ancient beyond recognition, others still bearing remnants of cloth and hair. The workers would spend the following days extracting 3 cartloads of human bones from that hellish pit, 3 cartloads of people who had been dropped through a trapdoor in the chapel floor above, their screams swallowed by stone walls 8 feet thick, their bodies left to rot in darkness upon those cruel spikes designed to ensure death came slowly, agonizingly, while the O'Carroll clan who ruled this fortress went about their daily lives mere feet above. But the workers reported something else, something that chilled them more than the discovery of mass murder. As they labored in that pit of death, they felt watched. Several claimed to see a shape in the shadows, something that moved wrong, that smelled of rotting flesh and brimstone. Something that had been trapped down there, feeding on darkness and suffering for centuries. This is Leap Castle, perched on a rocky outcrop in County Offaly, Ireland. Today it holds the grim distinction of being the most haunted location in a country already thick with ghost stories and supernatural legends. But what dwells within these walls goes beyond the typical tales of restless spirits and phantom footsteps. The entity that calls Leap Castle home defies categorization. Paranormal investigators who have dared to spend nights within its rooms speak of it only in whispers, if they speak of it at all. They call it an elemental, a creature that was never human, that exists in a realm beyond our understanding of life and death. The question that lingers in the shadows of Leap Castle is this: what kind of evil, what depth of human cruelty and bloodshed creates a creature that even those who hunt ghosts for a living fear to name? The stone walls of Leap Castle rise from the rocky earth of County Offaly like broken teeth, gray and weathered, marking a landscape that has witnessed centuries of human cruelty. These walls, built in the 13th century, became the ancestral seat of the O'Carroll clan, a family whose name would become synonymous with violence, treachery, and bloodshed across medieval Ireland. To understand the darkness that permeates this fortress, one must first understand the men who made it their home, the warriors who turned strategic necessity into an art of terror. The O'Carrolls arrived as chieftains in a land where power was measured not in gold or titles bestowed by distant kings, but in the ability to hold territory through sheer force of will and the sharp edge of a sword. They claimed dominion over a stretch of land that sat at the crossroads of ancient pathways, where travelers moved between the kingdoms of Munster and Leinster. This was no accident. The castle's location offered something more valuable than fertile fields or mineral wealth. It offered control. From the high windows of Leap Castle, sentries could observe movement across the boglands and rolling hills for miles in every direction. An army could not approach unseen. A rival clan could not pass without paying tribute or facing consequences. The fortress itself reflected the brutal pragmatism of its builders. Thick walls rose several feet high, designed to withstand siege engines and battering rams. Narrow windows, barely wide enough for an archer's bow, allowed defenders to rain arrows upon attackers while remaining protected from return fire. The entrance was a study in defensive architecture, a single doorway that forced visitors to approach in a vulnerable line, exposed to projectiles from above. Inside, the great hall dominated the main floor, a cavernous space where the clan would gather for feasts that often ended in violence, where alliances were forged and just as quickly shattered over perceived insults, or the strong drink that flowed freely. But the true character of Leap Castle was not shaped by its stones or strategic position. It was shaped by the men who walked its corridors, and the O'Carrolls were men of extraordinary violence, even by the harsh standards of medieval Ireland. Historical records from the period, kept by monks in distant monasteries and traveling scribes, paint a picture of a clan that seemed to revel in conflict. Where other families might seek peace through marriage alliances or negotiated settlements, the O'Carrolls chose the blade. They did not simply defend their territory. They expanded it through systematic campaigns of intimidation and murder. The clan's reputation for feuding became legendary throughout Ireland. These were not simple disputes over boundary lines or cattle theft, though such matters certainly sparked their share of bloodshed. The O'Carrolls pursued vendettas with a dedication that bordered on religious fervor. A slight against one member of the family became a debt owed by entire bloodlines. Revenge was not a momentary passion, but a carefully cultivated inheritance, passed from father to son, along with land and titles. Children grew up hearing tales of wrongs committed generations earlier, nursed on grievances that predated their births, trained to see violence as the only appropriate response to dishonor. Within the family itself, succession became a matter of survival rather than birthright. The O'Carrolls followed the ancient Irish tradition of tanistry, where leadership passed not automatically to the eldest son, but to the most capable male relative, as determined by the clan. In theory, this system ensured strong leadership. In practice, among the O'Carrolls, it meant that brothers eyed each other with suspicion, that uncles plotted against nephews, that every family gathering carried the potential for assassination. The Great Hall of Leap Castle witnessed murders committed not by enemies, but by blood relations, men who shared the same ancestors killing each other over the right to rule. One particularly brutal practice set the O'Carrolls apart, even among Ireland's warring clans. They became known for their systematic use of mercenaries, professional soldiers who would conduct raids and murders for payment. These were not the hired guards or professional armies employed by kings and great lords. The O'Carrolls hired gallowglass, fearsome warriors of mixed Norse and Gaelic descent who fought with massive axes and broadswords, men who viewed warfare as a trade and human life as a commodity. They hired kerns, lightly armed foot soldiers who specialized in quick raids and guerrilla tactics. These mercenaries gave the O'Carrolls reach beyond their own numbers, allowing them to strike at enemies across great distances, to conduct multiple campaigns simultaneously, to maintain a state of constant warfare that exhausted their rivals. The raids conducted by these hired soldiers followed a terrible pattern. They would descend upon a target under cover of darkness, moving swiftly through the countryside with practiced efficiency. Villages would wake to find their homes burning, their livestock driven away, their men cut down as they stumbled from their beds. The violence was not merely practical, designed to weaken enemies economically or militarily. It was theatrical, calculated to inspire terror. Bodies were left in public spaces as warnings. Survivors were allowed to escape specifically, so they could spread word of what they had witnessed. The message was clear and simple. Oppose the O'Carrolls and suffer. Back at Leap Castle, the spoils of these raids accumulated. Cattle crowded into pens below the castle walls. Stolen goods filled storage rooms. Hostages languished in dark cells, held for ransom or leverage in negotiations. The castle became not just a military fortress, but a processing center for violence. A place where the brutality conducted across the countryside was converted into wealth and power. The constant flow of plunder created a self-sustaining cycle. Raids brought resources, resources hired more mercenaries enabled larger raids. The O'Carrolls built an economy based on bloodshed. The surrounding population lived in perpetual fear. Farmers working fields near the castle kept their eyes on the fortress, watching for signs of activity that might signal an approaching raid. Travelers gave the area wide berth when possible, taking longer routes to avoid passing too close to O'Carroll territory. Local lords paid tribute regularly, not out of respect or feudal obligation, but simply to keep the clan's mercenaries from their doorsteps. Peace, in the shadow of Leap Castle, was merely the temporary absence of violence, a brief pause before the next outrage. Century by century, the violence accumulated. The stones of Leap Castle absorbed it all. Blood spilled in the Great Hall during family disputes, soaked into the wooden floors and stone foundations. The dungeons below ground level, where prisoners were held in conditions of unimaginable cruelty, became permeated with the stench of human suffering. The walls themselves seemed to remember every scream, every plea for mercy that went unanswered, every life extinguished within the fortress. Modern visitors to ancient castles often comment on the atmosphere of such places, the feeling of weight and age that hangs in the air. At Leap Castle, that atmosphere carried something heavier than mere age. It carried memory. The question arises, looking back across the centuries at this chronicle of cruelty, whether a place can truly absorb the violence committed within its walls. Can stone and mortar retain some imprint of human evil? The rational mind rejects such notions as superstition, the primitive thinking of people who did not understand the natural world. Yet the O'Carrolls themselves seem to believe in forces beyond the physical. They lived surrounded by the symbols and practices of an older Ireland, a land where the boundaries between the living world and the other world remained permeable, where certain actions could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Medieval Ireland existed in a liminal space between Christian faith, newly arrived from Rome, and older beliefs that stretched back into prehistory. The O'Carrolls maintained chapels within their castle and employed priests to perform masses, yet they also honored traditions that predated Christianity by millennia. They built their fortress on ground that locals claimed had been sacred to earlier peoples, places where the ancient inhabitants of Ireland had conducted their own mysterious rites. Whether through ignorance or arrogance, the O'Carrolls showed no concern for the significance of such locations. They took what they wanted, built where they chose, and gave no thought to what they might be disturbing. The castle's very name hints at darker origins. Leap or lane in Irish suggests a jumping place, but the true meaning has been lost to time. Some say it refers to a great leap made by a chieftain fleeing enemies. Others claim it marks a spot where prisoners were forced to jump to their deaths. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the castle's character, a place where even the name carries multiple layers of possible violence. As the centuries progressed, the O'Carrolls' power waxed and waned with the changing fortunes of Ireland itself, but their reputation for brutality remained constant. Generation after generation, the family produced men who seemed almost eager to add to the castle's dark legacy. They fought each other, they fought rival clans, they fought the encroaching English who sought to bring Ireland under crown control. Through it all, Leap Castle stood as their monument, a fortress that reflected their character in stone and shadow. The walls grew thick with history and horror. Every stone seemed to carry its own story of violence. The Great Hall, the dungeons, the chapel, the private chambers where family members plotted against each other, all became repositories of accumulated cruelty. The O'Carrolls had created something unique, a structure that served simultaneously as home, fortress, prison, and slaughterhouse. In doing so, they had created something that transcended mere architecture. They had built a place where the barrier between the natural and supernatural grew dangerously thin, worn away by centuries of human evil. What waited on the other side of that barrier, what their violence had awakened or invited into the world, would reveal itself in time. Foundation had been laid in blood and suffering. The worst was yet to come. The year 1532 marked a wound in Irish history that would never truly heal, a moment when the sacred bonds of both family and faith were shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. Within the stone walls of what would come to be known as the Bloody Chapel at Leap Castle, an act of such profound betrayal took place that its echo reverberates through the centuries, staining the very air with an anguish that refuses to fade. The O'Carroll clan had long been the undisputed rulers of the region surrounding Leap Castle, their power stretching across the wild Irish Midlands like an iron fist wrapped in velvet. For generations, they had commanded respect and fear in equal measure, their authority absolute, their word law. But as with many powerful families throughout history, the seeds of their destruction were sown, not by external enemies, but from within their own bloodline. The O'Carrolls were a family perpetually at war with themselves, each generation breeding new rivalries, new hatreds, new reasons for brothers to turn against brothers. In that fateful year, two brothers found themselves locked in a struggle that went beyond mere sibling rivalry. This was a battle for succession, for control, for the very soul of the O'Carroll legacy. One brother had chosen the path of the church, becoming a priest who conducted mass in the family's private chapel. The other had chosen the path of the sword, a warrior whose ambitions knew no bounds and whose patience had worn dangerously thin. The warrior brother believed himself the rightful heir to the O'Carroll power, and he viewed his priest brother not as a man of God, but as an obstacle to be removed. The tension between them had been building for months, perhaps years. Whispered arguments in darkened corridors, heated exchanges during family gatherings. The slow, inexorable descent into a hatred so pure and consuming that it blinded the warrior brother to all reason, to all morality, to all the commandments that his priest brother preached from the pulpit each Sunday. On that morning in 1532, the family gathered for Mass in their private chapel as they had countless times before. The room was small and intimate, designed for the exclusive use of the O'Carroll family and their most trusted retainers. Candles flickered against the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The altar stood at the far end of the chamber, draped in fine cloth, adorned with sacred vessels that gleamed in the golden light. It was a place meant for prayer, for communion with the divine, for the quiet contemplation of eternal truths. The priest brother stood at the altar, his back to the congregation as tradition demanded, his hands raised in the ancient gestures of the Mass. He wore the vestments of his office, the symbols of his dedication to a power higher than any earthly throne. His voice echoed softly through the chapel, speaking the Latin words that had been spoken in this same ritual for over 1,000 years. The small congregation bowed their heads in prayer, their eyes closed, their thoughts turned to heaven. None of them saw the warrior brother rise from his pew. None of them noticed as his hand moved to the hilt of the sword at his side, a weapon that should never have been drawn in such a holy place. The priest continued his prayers, unaware that his own brother was approaching from behind, unaware that the footsteps he might have heard were those of his murderer, not another worshiper coming forward to receive communion. The moment of the killing was one of absolute desecration. As the priest raised the chalice during the most sacred portion of the Mass, as his lips moved in the words of consecration that transformed wine into blood, his brother drove a sword through his back with such force that the blade emerged from his chest. The priest's hands, still holding the chalice aloft, trembled violently. The sacred vessel fell from his grasp, clattering against the altar as the wine within it mixed with his own blood that now poured forth from the terrible wound. Witnesses later described the scene in terms that spoke of absolute horror. The priest did not die immediately. Instead, he turned slowly, his hands clutching at the blade, protruding from his chest, his eyes meeting those of his brother for one final, terrible moment. What passed between them in that instant, no one could say. Recognition, certainly. Betrayal, beyond doubt. Perhaps confusion, as the dying priest struggled to comprehend how the brother he had known since childhood could commit such an act in such a place. The warrior brother did not speak. He did not offer justification or explanation. He simply withdrew the sword from his brother's body and watched as the priest collapsed against the altar, his blood flowing across the sacred surface, dripping onto the stone floor, pooling beneath the very place where the body of Christ was meant to be honored and worshipped. The priest lived for several more agonizing minutes, his lips still moving in prayer even as his lifeblood drained away. Some accounts suggest that he continued attempting to perform the Mass, his training and devotion so ingrained that even in death, he sought to fulfill his sacred duty. His hands reached toward the spilled chalice, trying to right what had been overturned, trying to restore order to a scene of utter chaos. When death finally claimed him, slumped across the altar he had consecrated countless times, the silence in the chapel was absolute. The congregation sat frozen in their pews, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The warrior brother stood over his victim, sword still in hand, the blade dripping blood onto the floor in a steady rhythm that sounded obscenely loud in the terrible quiet. The motivations behind this fratricide were complex and deeply rooted in the political realities of 16th century Ireland. The O'Carroll succession was never a simple matter of primogeniture. Brothers fought brothers, cousins plotted against cousins, and the family tree was pruned as often by violence as by natural death. The warrior brother believed that his priest brother wielded too much influence over their aging father, that his counsel swayed decisions about inheritance and power. There were whispers of documents being prepared, of changes to the succession that would diminish the warrior's claims in favor of arrangements more favorable to the priest's vision for the family's future. But beyond the practical considerations of power and inheritance, there was something deeper at work. The murder was not simply a political assassination. It was an act of profound sacrilege, a deliberate violation of the most fundamental taboos of both family and faith. To kill during Mass was to spit in the face of God himself. To murder one's own brother was to tear apart the most basic bonds of human kinship. To shed blood on the altar was to defile the very heart of sacred space. The chapel where this atrocity occurred became known immediately as the Bloody Chapel, a name that has clung to it through the intervening centuries like a curse that cannot be lifted. The stains of blood, though scrubbed away by horrified servants, seemed to reappear on the altar stones. The air itself felt different, charged with a malevolence that made even the bravest souls hesitate before entering. And it is here, in this small room where brother murdered brother, that the darkest and most intense paranormal activity at Leap Castle is reported. Visitors and paranormal investigators alike describe the Bloody Chapel as a place of overwhelming oppression, where the weight of ancient horror presses down like a physical force. The most common experience reported in the Bloody Chapel is a sudden, inexplicable difficulty breathing. People who enter the room feeling perfectly healthy find themselves gasping for air, their chests constricting as though an invisible hand were squeezing their lungs. Some describe it as feeling like drowning while standing on dry land, a sensation of suffocation that grows more intense the longer they remain in the space. Others report sharp, stabbing pains in their chests, particularly when standing near where the altar once stood. These pains come without warning, sudden, and severe enough to double people over, driving them to their knees in the same spot where the priest fell over 400 years ago. Medical examinations after the fact find nothing wrong with these visitors, no heart conditions or physical ailments that could explain the intense pain they experienced. It comes and it goes, tied inexplicably to their presence in that specific room. Temperature anomalies are frequently documented in the Bloody Chapel. Even on warm summer days, the room maintains an icy chill that seems to emanate from the stones themselves. Visitors have measured temperature drops of 20 degrees or more upon crossing the threshold, their breath suddenly visible in the air, frost forming on the walls despite the heat outside. Some sensitive individuals claim to see the murder replaying itself. A residual haunting burns so deeply into the fabric of the place that it repeats endlessly like a recording. They describe seeing a figure in priestly robes standing at an altar that no longer exists physically, raising his hands in prayer. They see the shadow behind him, the flash of steel, the terrible moment of penetration. They watch as he falls, his blood darkening the stones, his lips moving in prayers that no one can hear anymore. The Bloody Chapel is considered by many paranormal researchers to be the epicenter of Leap Castle's hauntings, the source from which all other supernatural manifestations flow. The theory suggests that the murder was so horrific, so laden with emotional and spiritual trauma, that it created a kind of wound in reality itself. The desecration of sacred space, the violation of family bonds, the mixture of violence and religious ritual created a perfect storm of negative energy that has never dissipated. The castle has seen other deaths, other tragedies, other moments of horror in its long history, but none carry the same weight as the fratricide in the Bloody Chapel. This was not a death in battle, not an execution of an enemy, not even a murder driven by passion or greed in the ordinary sense. This was a calculated act of ultimate betrayal, carried out in the most sacred moment, in the most holy place, against the person who should have been most protected by bonds of blood and faith. To stand in the Bloody Chapel today is to stand in a place where history is not past but present, where the events of 1532 are as real and immediate as they were on the day they occurred. The room remembers, the stones remember, and some part of the murdered priest, it seems, remains trapped there still, endlessly conducting his final mass, endlessly dying at his brother's hand, endlessly bleeding upon an altar that has long since crumbled to dust, but whose spiritual presence lingers like a ghost itself. Beneath the cold stone floors of the Bloody Chapel, in the deepest foundations of the castle where no light had penetrated for centuries, there existed a chamber that embodied humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. The Oubliette, from the French word meaning to forget, represented something far more sinister than a simple prison cell. This was a place designed not merely to contain, but to obliterate, to erase human beings from existence as thoroughly as if they had never drawn breath. The entrance was deceptively simple. A trap door, no larger than 3 feet square, set flush with the chapel floor. Ornate tiles surrounded it, decorated with religious imagery that made the horror beneath all the more obscene. Worshippers might kneel in prayer, mere inches from this portal to hell, never suspecting that beneath their clasped hands lay a vertical shaft, dropping 20 feet into absolute darkness. The medieval architects who designed this death trap understood the psychology of terror with disturbing precision. They knew that the anticipation, the moment when a prisoner realized what awaited them, could be as devastating as the physical trauma to come. The mechanism was brutally efficient. Guards would open the trap door, and the condemned, bound and helpless, would be pushed through the opening. For a fraction of a second, there would be nothing but air and darkness. Then came the impact. The floor of the Oubliette was not solid stone. Instead, medieval craftsmen had installed a series of wooden spikes, each one carefully shaped and positioned to ensure maximum damage while avoiding immediate death. The spikes were arranged in a pattern designed by men who understood anatomy, who knew precisely where to wound a human body to cause unbearable agony while preventing the merciful release of quick death. Imagine the moment of impact. A body falling 20 feet gains tremendous velocity, and the force of landing on those upturned spikes would drive them deep into flesh and muscle. But the placement was calculated. The spikes would pierce through limbs, through the torso at angles that avoided major arteries. A victim might land with wooden points driven through their thigh, their shoulder, their abdomen, pinning them in place like an insect in some grotesque collection. The pain would be immediate and all-consuming, a white-hot agony that made coherent thought impossible. But this was only the beginning. The true horror of the Oubliette lay not in the initial trauma, but in what came after. Trapped in complete darkness, impaled on wooden spikes, unable to move without driving the points deeper into their own flesh, victims would linger. Hours would pass, then days. The cold stone walls would echo with screams until throats became too raw to produce sound. Thirst would become maddening. The smell of their own blood, pooling beneath them, would fill their nostrils. And in that darkness, as consciousness faded and returned in waves of delirium, they would not be alone. The bones of previous victims surrounded them. In the pitch black, a hand might brush against a skull, fingers might tangle in the remains of someone who had suffered the same fate weeks or months or years before. The psychological torment of knowing that you were joining a collection of the forgotten, that your bones would lie here in darkness until they crumbled to dust, added a layer of existential horror to the physical suffering. Some victims, according to later estimates based on the injuries found on skeletal remains, survived for as long as 3 or 4 days in that pit. 3 or 4 days of agony, terror, and slow realization that no rescue would come, that you had been dropped into a place specifically designed to erase you from the world above. The purpose of the Oubliette went beyond mere execution. Medieval lords had many ways to kill. The Oubliette served a different function. It was a tool of absolute power, a way to make someone disappear so completely that even their death became uncertain. No trial, no public execution, no marked grave. One moment, a person existed, the next they were simply gone, swallowed by the chapel floor. For the families left behind, there would be no closure, no body to mourn, only the terrible suspicion of what might have happened, and the enforced silence that came from knowing that asking too many questions might lead to joining the disappeared. For centuries, the Oubliette kept its secrets. The trap door was eventually sealed, the chapel floor rebuilt and modified through various renovations. The killing floor beneath became part of the castle's forgotten architecture, known perhaps to a few but never discussed, never acknowledged. The screams that once echoed from beneath the chapel faded into silence, and the bones continued to accumulate in the darkness below. Then came the summer of 1923. The castle had changed hands, purchased by new owners who envisioned renovations and modern improvements. A crew of workmen arrived to clear away centuries of accumulated debris and prepare the structure for restoration. They were working in the area of the old chapel, when one of them noticed an inconsistency in the floor. The stones didn't quite align properly. There appeared to be a seam, carefully concealed but detectable once you knew to look for it. The workers pried up the stones, expecting perhaps to find an old storage vault or architectural curiosity. Instead, they discovered the trap door. Rusted hinges groaned as they lifted it open, and a smell rose from below that made several men step back in revulsion. It was the smell of death, so old and concentrated that it had soaked into the very stone. One of the workers lowered a lantern into the shaft, and in the flickering light, they saw what lay below. The floor of the pit was invisible beneath a carpet of bones. Human remains, tangled and overlapping, filled the oubliette to a depth of several feet. Skulls stared upward with empty sockets. Rib cages lay crushed and scattered. Long bones had been snapped and splintered, and protruding through this charnel layer, they could see the remnants of the wooden spikes. Some still standing, others broken off, all of them stained dark with substances that had dried centuries ago. The workers spent 3 days clearing the pit. They filled 3 full carts with human remains, making trip after trip to remove the accumulated evidence of centuries of murder. As they worked, carefully extracting the tangled bones, they began to notice details that made the horror more specific, more real. Some of the bones showed obvious trauma consistent with spike wounds. A pelvis with a circular puncture straight through the bone. A rib cage with multiple ribs shattered on one side where a body had landed heavily on the points. A skull with a triangular hole punched through the temple, suggesting someone had fallen at an angle that drove a spike directly into their head, perhaps granting them a quicker death than most. Mixed among the human remains, they found other objects that told fragments of stories. Rusted weapons corroded beyond use, pieces of armor and chainmail, suggesting that some of the victims had been soldiers or knights. Scraps of cloth that disintegrated at a touch. A few personal items, buttons and buckles, and the occasional piece of jewelry, the small possessions that people carried with them until the moment they were dropped into darkness and forgot everything but pain. Forensic experts who examined the remains estimated that the bones represented at least 150 individuals, though the true number could have been significantly higher. Centuries of weight and decomposition had crushed and fragmented the earliest remains, making exact counts impossible. The victims appeared to span several hundred years, from the medieval period through perhaps the 17th century, suggesting that the oubliette had remained in active use far longer than anyone had suspected. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community and attracted attention from historians and archaeologists across Europe. This was physical proof of practices that had existed mostly in historical records and folklore. The oubliette was not a legend or an exaggeration. It was real, and it had been used repeatedly, methodically, for generations. The scale of the killing, the calculated cruelty of the method, forced a reckoning with the darkness that could exist beneath the surface of civilized society. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the discovery was what it revealed about the castle's supernatural reputation. For centuries, people had reported hearing screams coming from the chapel area. Witnesses described voices crying out in agony, begging for help or mercy, sounds that seemed to come from beneath the floor. These accounts had been dismissed as imagination, as the product of suggestible minds influenced by the castle's dark history. Now, suddenly, there was a rational explanation. Those screams had been real. For hundreds of years, people had been dying slowly in that pit, their voices carrying up through the stone, audible to anyone who happened to be in the chapel above. The ghosts that haunted this place were not supernatural entities, but echoes of actual suffering, the residual horror of what had transpired in the darkness below. Today the oubliette remains, though it has been sealed for safety. The trap door is covered, the shaft filled in, but the knowledge of what existed there continues to cast its shadow over the castle. Every cold spot, every unexplained sound, every sensation of being watched, carries a new weight of possibility. This is not a place where people simply died. This is a place where death was engineered, where suffering was the point, where human beings were dropped into darkness and forgotten while they slowly ceased to exist. The 3 cartloads of bones removed in 1923 were given a proper burial, but the oubliette itself remains as a monument to cruelty, a physical reminder that the true horror is not what we imagine in darkness, but what human beings are capable of doing to one another when power removes all restraint. The early 1900s brought many changes to Leap Castle, but perhaps none more significant than the arrival of its new mistress, Mildred Darby. She inherited the castle through marriage to Jonathan Darby, descendant of the family that had claimed the fortress centuries earlier. Mildred was not your typical Edwardian lady. She possessed a keen intellect, a thorough education unusual for women of her time, and a deep fascination with the occult and paranormal phenomena that existed far beyond the edges of polite society. Where others saw crumbling stones and faded grandeur, Mildred saw opportunity. She had studied ancient texts, corresponded with researchers across Europe, and maintained detailed journals of her investigations into spiritual matters. Her background in occult research made her approach to the supernatural methodical, rather than hysterical. She recorded observations with scientific precision, cataloging events with dates, times, and environmental conditions. This was a woman who sought understanding, not sensationalism. Her education and social standing gave her accounts a credibility that mere folklore could never achieve. When Mildred took residence at Leap Castle, she knew its reputation. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the bloody chapel, about the oubliette filled with skeletal remains, about the murders and betrayals that had soaked into the very stones. But Mildred believed herself prepared for whatever lingered in those ancient halls. She had faced the unknown before, or so she thought. Nothing in her previous experience, however, could have prepared her for what she would encounter in the spring of 1909. It began in the gallery, a long corridor lined with faded portraits and narrow windows that barely held back the Irish darkness. Mildred was alone that evening, walking through the castle as she often did, observing, taking mental notes, feeling the weight of history pressing down from the vaulted ceiling. The castle had been unusually quiet that day, she would later write, the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath before something terrible happens. The first indication that something was wrong came with the temperature. The gallery grew suddenly, drastically cold. This was not the gradual chill of evening settling in through drafty windows. This was immediate, unnatural, a cold that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond the physical world. Mildred felt it penetrate through her heavy skirts, through the layers of Edwardian propriety that armored her against the world. It was the kind of cold that seeps into bone marrow, that makes the body forget what warmth ever felt like. She stopped walking. Her breath formed clouds in the air before her, which should have been impossible given that moments before the temperature had been mild. The candles she carried flickered wildly despite the absence of any breeze. Then came the smell. Mildred would later write that no words could truly capture the horror of that stench. It was not simply unpleasant. It was an assault, an olfactory violence that made her stomach clench and her eyes water. She described it as the reek of decomposing flesh, but not fresh decay. This was ancient putrefaction, the smell of bodies left to rot in forgotten places for months or years. Layered beneath that was something else, something sharp and acrid that burned in her nostrils. Sulfur, she identified it, like the traditional brimstone of medieval hell descriptions. The combination was overwhelming. This educated, composed woman, who prided herself on rational observation, felt her gorge rise. She pressed a handkerchief to her face, but it did nothing to filter out that terrible smell. It seemed to bypass her physical senses entirely, to imprint itself directly onto her consciousness. She would write that she could taste it, that it seemed to coat her tongue with the flavor of corruption and ancient evil. Mildred considered fleeing, but something held her in place. Perhaps it was her researcher's instinct, the need to observe and document. Perhaps it was simple paralysis, the body frozen while the mind screamed to run. She stood there in the gallery, breathing shallowly through her handkerchief, watching the candlelight dance in patterns that seemed wrong somehow, too irregular, too purposeful. That is when she saw it. The thing materialized gradually, as if pulling itself into visibility from some other plane of existence. It appeared roughly 15 feet away from where she stood, between her and the gallery's far door. At first, Mildred thought her eyes were playing tricks in the uncertain light, but as it solidified, became more present, more real, she understood that she was seeing something that should not exist in the natural world. The creature was approximately the size of a large sheep. She would later write, trying desperately to give it familiar dimensions, to ground the impossible in comparative terms her readers might understand. But their any resemblance to earthly animals ended absolutely. It possessed a roughly humanoid shape, standing upright, but it was impossibly thin, almost skeletal in its proportions. The body appeared hunched, twisted, as if whatever force animated it had bent it into this agonized posture. The skin, if it could be called skin, was grayish-black, like flesh that had been burned or long exposed to corruption. It did not reflect the candlelight naturally. Instead, it seemed to absorb illumination, to drink in the light and give nothing back. The texture appeared wrong, neither smooth nor textured in any recognizable way, but somehow both and neither simultaneously. But it was the face, or what passed for a face, that would haunt Mildred for the rest of her days. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets, deep and empty, and somehow aware. Those voids stared at her, with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman, utterly cold. The thing had no visible mouth, no nose, just that terrible smoothness broken only by those watching hollows. Mildred stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to flee, but she could not move. The creature did not approach. It simply existed there in the gallery, radiating malevolence, filling the space with its wrongness. She would later emphasize in her writings, with a vehemence that suggested how important this distinction was to her, that this was absolutely not a ghost. She had encountered ghosts before. She knew the feel of human spirits, the echo of personalities that once lived and breathed and loved and hated. This was something entirely other. This had never been human. This was ancient, she wrote. Something that existed long before humans walked the earth. Something that predated civilization, predated perhaps the very concept of humanity itself. The entity was elemental, she declared, using a term from occult literature to describe spirits of pure essence, beings of earth and air and darkness that had no connection to the human experience. It was malevolent in a way that transcended human evil. A murderer might kill from rage or greed or madness, all emotions Mildred could intellectually understand, even if she found them abhorrent. But this thing's malevolence was fundamental, essential to its nature in a way that made human wickedness seem almost quaint by comparison. They remained locked in that terrible tableau for what Mildred estimated was 3 to 5 minutes, though she admitted her sense of time had become unreliable. The cold continued. The stench continued. The thing simply stood there, radiating waves of wrongness that made reality itself feel thin and unstable. Then, as gradually as it had appeared, it began to fade. The darkness seemed to drink it back into whatever realm it had emerged from. The hollow sockets were the last things to vanish, watching her until the final moment. When it was gone completely, the temperature returned to normal with shocking abruptness. The smell dissipated, though Mildred swore she could still detect traces of it for days afterward. Her response to this encounter revealed much about her character. Where others might have fled Leap Castle entirely, Mildred saw a challenge. She was an occult researcher, after all. She had studied banishing rituals, cleansing ceremonies, protective wards from a dozen different traditions. She believed that with the proper knowledge and preparation, any spiritual presence could be managed, controlled, or expelled. How wrong she was. Mildred began her cleansing rituals within days of the encounter. She used techniques drawn from ceremonial magic, from Catholic exorcism traditions, from ancient Celtic practices. She burned herbs, traced symbols, spoke words of power in languages both living and dead. She approached the work with academic rigor and genuine conviction that she could purify Leap Castle of its dark inhabitant. The results were catastrophic. Rather than weakening or banishing the elemental, her rituals seemed to enrage it. The activity at Leap Castle intensified dramatically. The creature began appearing with greater frequency, manifesting in different parts of the castle. Other family members and servants reported encounters. Objects moved on their own. The smell of decay and sulfur would suddenly permeate rooms. The temperature would plummet without warning. Mildred documented all of it, even as she realized her mistake. Her cleansing attempts had not driven the entity away. They had awakened it more fully, drawn its attention, perhaps even challenged it in ways she had not anticipated. She had poked at something ancient and powerful with the tools of human understanding, and it had responded with what might have been anger, if something so alien could be said to feel human emotions. Her account, published in occult journals and later repeated in various forms, became the first detailed documentation of the Leap Castle elemental. It gave researchers specific details, a description grounded in observation rather than legend. It also served as a warning about the dangers of assuming that knowledge alone could master forces beyond human comprehension. Mildred Darby lived at Leap Castle for several more years, coexisting uneasily with the presence she could neither understand nor banish. Her testimony remains one of the most credible and detailed encounters with the entity, precisely because she approached it not as a hysterical witness, but as an educated observer who understood how easily the mind could be deceived, and who still insisted that what she saw was terribly, impossibly real. In the shadowed corners of Irish folklore, where ancient knowledge meets modern fear, there exists a category of entities that defy simple classification. They are not the departed souls of the dead, wandering the earth in search of resolution. They are not demons in the traditional sense, those fallen angels of Christian mythology, locked in eternal rebellion. They are something older, something that predates human civilization itself. They are the elementals, and understanding what walks the halls of Leap Castle requires us to venture deep into the occult theories and ancestral wisdom that have tried to explain these primitive forces for centuries. The term elemental itself carries weight in Irish tradition, referring to spirits intrinsically bound to the natural world. In their benign form, these entities were the guardians of sacred groves, the whispers in ancient forests, the presence felt beside remote mountain streams. They were neither good nor evil in human terms, but rather existed in a state of pure, primal being. The old ones knew to respect them, to leave offerings at threshold spaces where the human world touched the wild. But folklore also speaks of elementals that turned, that became corrupted, or drew their sustenance from darker sources. These were the nature spirits gone malevolent, twisted by human transgression, or awakened by violence into something actively hostile to life itself. What makes the elemental of Leap Castle so profoundly disturbing is its deviation from this expected pattern. Most accounts of malevolent elementals place them firmly in natural settings, far from human habitation. A spirit of rage dwelling in a storm-lashed cliff face. A presence of ancient hunger lurking in the depths of a bottomless bog. A watcher in the forest that remembers when no humans walked these lands. But the entity at Leap Castle has bound itself, or been bound, to a place of human construction, to a stronghold built by human hands and soaked in human blood. This marriage of primordial force and human evil creates something uniquely terrible. Paranormal researchers who have studied the case present several competing theories about what could create such an entity, or draw it to such a location. The first and perhaps most widely accepted theory suggests that accumulated violence can, over time, generate or attract non-human intelligences. Leap Castle certainly qualifies as a nexus of suffering. Beyond the massacre in the bloody chapel, beyond the Oubliette filled with forgotten corpses, the castle witnessed centuries of smaller cruelties. Betrayals, murders, tortures carried out in the pursuit of power. Each act of violence, some researchers propose, leaves an energetic residue, and when that residue accumulates over decades or centuries in a confined space, it can achieve a kind of critical mass. It becomes a beacon, drawing entities that feed on such energies, or perhaps even coalescing into a new form of consciousness entirely, one born from human malevolence, but possessing none of our humanity. The second theory ventures into the realm of ritual magic, gone catastrophically wrong. The late medieval and early modern periods saw a flourishing of occult practices among the educated classes, and the O'Carroll family, despite their violent reputation, were not ignorant men. They had access to grimoires, to the esoteric knowledge circulating through Europe during the Renaissance. Some researchers speculate that an O'Carroll patriarch, perhaps seeking power or protection or vengeance, may have performed a summoning ritual. These ceremonies, documented in texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon and other grimoires of ceremonial magic, were designed to call forth entities and bind them to service. But such rituals were notoriously dangerous, requiring precise execution and unwavering will. A single error in the protective circle, a mispronounced word in the conjuration, a moment of fear that broke concentration. Any of these could result in something being brought through that could not be controlled or banished. If this theory holds truth, then the elemental at Leap Castle might be something summoned centuries ago, something that escaped its bonds and has dwelt in the castle ever since, growing stronger on the violence and fear that permeates the stones. The third theory is perhaps the most chilling, suggesting that the entity was deliberately summoned and deliberately left unbanished as an act of malice or desperation. Imagine an O'Carroll lord, knowing his enemies were closing in, performing a final act of spite, calling something into the castle that would ensure no one could ever truly possess it, not even his own descendants. Or consider the possibility of a curse laid by someone wronged by the family, a victim or a rival with knowledge of the dark arts, who bound something malevolent to the bloodline or the building itself. In this scenario, the elemental serves as an eternal guardian or punishment, a supernatural landmine waiting for the unwary. But theories are one thing, and witness testimony is another. Since Mildred Darby's encounter and description of the entity in the early 1900s, others have experienced the presence, and the consistency of their accounts lends credence to the idea that something genuinely anomalous haunts those halls. The smell, that nauseating combination of decay and sulfur, appears in account after account. Visitors who know nothing of Darby's writings report the same overwhelming stench appearing suddenly in specific areas of the castle, particularly near the Bloody Chapel and on the main staircase. The smell is often the first warning, arriving seconds before an oppressive sense of presence descends. What strikes researchers examining these accounts is the remarkable consistency in the emotional and psychological impact of encounters. Witnesses describe a feeling that goes beyond normal fear, something that touches on primal terror. They report an overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something that predates human consciousness, something that regards humanity with neither love nor hate, but with a kind of primitive, alien hunger. This is not the melancholy presence of a ghost longing for resolution. It is not even the oppressive malevolence sometimes attributed to demonic entities. It is something colder, something that feels ancient and inhuman in a way that strips away the comfortable illusions of our centrality in the universe. A paranormal investigator who spent 3 nights in the castle during the 1990s reported an encounter on the main staircase at approximately 3 in the morning. He described waking from an uneasy sleep with the absolute conviction that he was no longer alone. The temperature had dropped precipitously, his breath misting in the air despite it being summer. Then came the smell, so powerful he nearly vomited, and with it a sense of presence so malevolent, so utterly inhuman, that his conscious mind simply rebelled. He found himself running, all professional detachment abandoned, fleeing down the stairs and out of the castle entirely. He later stated that in 20 years of investigating reportedly haunted locations, he had never experienced anything remotely comparable. The entity at Leap Castle, he insisted, was not a ghost. It was not a confused spirit or a residual haunting. It was something aware, something intelligent, and something that viewed humans as a predator views prey. Another witness, a historian visiting the castle in 2003 to research the O'Carroll family, reported a similar experience in the Bloody Chapel itself. She described standing in the small room, taking measurements and photographs, when the atmosphere suddenly changed. The air became thick, harder to breathe, and a smell like rotting meat filled the space. But more disturbing than the physical sensations was the psychological assault. She described feeling an overwhelming sense of her own insignificance, of being observed by something that had existed long before humans built castles or wrote histories, something that would continue to exist long after humanity had vanished. The intelligence behind that gaze, she said, was utterly alien, lacking any framework of morality or emotion that humans would recognize. It simply was, existing in a state of predatory awareness. She left the castle immediately, and later admitted she had nightmares for months afterward. These accounts, separated by years and given by individuals with no connection to each other, paint a remarkably consistent picture. The elemental of Leap Castle, whatever its true nature, manifests with particular characteristics. The smell, the temperature drop, the sense of overwhelming malevolent presence, and most distinctively, the feeling of confronting something profoundly inhuman and ancient. This consistency distinguishes it from the often vague and contradictory reports that characterize many allegedly haunted locations. In Irish folklore, the proper relationship with elementals involves respect, boundaries, and the wisdom to leave certain things undisturbed. One does not casually intrude on spaces where such entities dwell. One does not presume to understand or control forces that existed before human language gave them names. The ancient Druids understood this, maintaining careful protocols for interacting with the other world and its inhabitants. But the O'Carrolls, in their violence and ambition, may have violated these ancient understandings. They built their stronghold and filled it with blood, and in doing so, they created the perfect conditions for something elemental, something primal and malevolent, to take up residence. The question that haunts researchers is whether the elemental was drawn to the violence, or whether the violence somehow created it. Did centuries of murder and suffering generate a new form of consciousness, an accretion of malevolence that achieved independent existence? Or was there always something there, some ancient spirit of the land, twisted and darkened by its exposure to human evil, until it became the nightmare presence that Mildred Darby encountered on those dark stairs? Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the distinction between a spirit corrupted by evil and evil that has achieved consciousness is ultimately meaningless. What matters is that something dwells in Leap Castle, something that continues to manifest, something that witnesses describe with remarkable consistency as primitive, inhuman, and profoundly malevolent. Something that reminds us, in the most visceral way possible, that there are forces in this world that predate our understanding, that exist outside our neat categories of heaven and hell, ghost and demon. Forces that are simply other, and in their otherness, utterly terrifying. The 1990s brought new life to Leap Castle, but that life came with a price that nobody expected. When Sean Ryan and his family purchased the deteriorating fortress in the early part of that decade, they saw opportunity where others saw only decay. The castle had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling, nature reclaiming what generations had left behind. Sean envisioned restoration, a return to glory for one of Ireland's most notorious landmarks. What he didn't anticipate was that the castle's most permanent residents had no intention of leaving. The Ryan family moved into the habitable portions of the structure while beginning the painstaking work of restoration. Within weeks, Sean's wife began experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. She would enter rooms and find the temperature had plummeted to near freezing, her breath misting before her face even on warm summer days. Objects disappeared from where she'd placed them only minutes before, reappearing in impossible locations. Tools left on scaffolding would be found scattered across the floor of the bloody chapel. At first, she attributed these incidents to the confusion of living in a construction site, to misplaced items and faulty memory. But the disturbances escalated in ways that couldn't be dismissed. One afternoon, while working alone in what had once been the main hall, she felt a presence behind her so tangible, so undeniably there, that she spun around expecting to find one of the construction workers. The space behind her stood empty, but the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. It intensified. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe, and then came the smell. Witnesses across more than a century had described this odor in remarkably consistent terms, and now she understood why the words seemed inadequate. It wasn't simply a bad smell or even the stench of decay. This was something fundamentally wrong, an assault on the senses that triggered primal revulsion. Sulphurous and putrid, like rotting flesh mixed with burning hair, the smell filled her nostrils and throat. She fled the hall, gasping for clean air, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sean himself remained skeptical, at least publicly. He'd purchased a castle with a reputation, certainly, and local legends were to be expected. Ireland had no shortage of haunted sites, and ghost stories attracted tourists. But as the restoration progressed, he experienced incidents that challenged his rational worldview. He began keeping a journal of the unexplained events, initially to document what he assumed would eventually be explained. The journal grew thicker with each passing month. Heavy footsteps echoed through empty corridors at night, pacing back and forth with deliberate, measured steps. Multiple family members heard them, ruling out the possibility of individual hallucination. Doors that Sean had personally locked and bolted would be found standing open the next morning, their locks still engaged. Voices whispered in empty rooms, too indistinct to make out words, but clearly human in origin, or at least mimicking human speech. And always, there was the sense of being unwelcome in certain parts of the building, particularly the Bloody Chapel and anywhere near the Oubliette. The Oubliette itself became a focal point for activity. Sealed off during initial restoration work for safety reasons, the dungeon seemed to generate its own atmosphere of dread. Workers refused to go near the area alone. Several quit the project entirely after experiencing what they described as aggressive presences. One mason reported being shoved from behind while working near the entrance to the dungeon, nearly falling down a flight of stone steps. When he turned, no one was there. Another worker described feeling invisible hands grip his shoulders with tremendous force, the pressure so intense it left bruises. He abandoned his tools and never returned to collect them. As word spread about the castle's ongoing activity, paranormal investigation teams began requesting permission to spend nights within its walls. Sean Ryan, still grappling with his own experiences, reluctantly agreed. Perhaps, he reasoned, these groups with their equipment and methodologies could provide explanations where he had found none. What he didn't expect was that their investigations would only deepen the mystery. A team from Dublin arrived in the autumn of 2001, equipped with thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recording equipment. They set up their base of operations in the main hall, running cables throughout the accessible portions of the castle. The night began quietly enough, with routine readings and ambient temperature recordings. Around 2 in the morning, their equipment began registering anomalies near the Bloody Chapel. Temperature fluctuations of 20 degrees within seconds. Electromagnetic spikes that defied conventional explanation. One investigator, a woman named Catherine, who participated in dozens of investigations across Ireland, entered the chapel with a video camera. The footage from that night, which has since been analyzed by numerous researchers, shows Catherine panning across the empty chapel, narrating her observations in a calm, professional tone. Then, abruptly, her narration stops. The camera jerks to the right, focusing on a corner of the room where shadows seem to pool more deeply than ambient light conditions would explain. Catherine's breathing becomes audible on the recording, rapid and shallow. She backs toward the doorway, and just before she exits the frame, a sound erupts from somewhere deeper in the castle. The audio recording captures it clearly, a prolonged guttural noise that resembles nothing so much as an animal in distress, but with an underlying quality that suggests something far more disturbing. The pitch and timbre fall outside the normal range of human vocalization, yet there's an intentionality to it, a sense of communication or warning. Catherine fled the chapel, and the entire team gathered in the main hall to review the recording. As they played back the audio, trying to determine the source of the sound, the smell arrived. Not gradually, but all at once, as if an invisible barrier had broken. All 6 team members later testified to the same experience, the overwhelming stench of decay and sulfur that seemed to emanate from the direction of the Oubliette. Within seconds, the odor became unbearable. One investigator vomited. Another began hyperventilating. They grabbed their essential equipment and evacuated the castle, leaving thousands of pounds worth of gear behind in their haste to escape. The following morning, Sean Ryan found their equipment neatly stacked in the courtyard, though the team swore they'd left it scattered throughout the interior. None of them could explain how the gear had been moved, and none were willing to re-enter the castle to investigate. Catherine, the most experienced member of the group, wrote in her official report that in 15 years of paranormal investigation, she'd never encountered anything that compared to the presence at Leap Castle. She described it as actively malevolent, intelligent, and utterly inhuman. This 2001 investigation marked a turning point in how seriously researchers regarded Leap Castle. The team's credentials were impeccable, their equipment sophisticated, and their testimony unshakable. Other groups followed, drawn by the documented evidence and consistent reports. A pattern emerged from these investigations. The entity, or entities, inhabiting the castle demonstrated territorial behavior, particularly regarding the Bloody Chapel and the Oubliette. Activity intensified dramatically whenever investigators approached these areas or discussed them openly. Several teams reported physical attacks, ranging from scratches appearing on exposed skin to violent shoving and overwhelming feelings of rage directed at them. A 2002 investigation by a British team included a psychic medium who'd worked with law enforcement on missing persons cases. She entered the castle with no prior knowledge of its history, deliberately kept uninformed to prevent bias. Within minutes of entering the bloody chapel, she became visibly distressed. She described sensing a presence that wasn't ghost or spirit in the conventional sense, but something older and fundamentally different from human consciousness. She used the word elemental, though she admitted the term felt inadequate. This entity, she claimed, had been at Leap Castle far longer than any of the human deaths or tragedies. The violence and bloodshed had fed it, strengthened it, given it more power to manifest. When her handlers guided her toward the Oubliette, she refused to go further, becoming increasingly agitated. She reported sensing layer upon layer of death, pain soaked into the stones themselves, and beneath it all, something that delighted in human suffering. The medium left the castle in a state of near panic and refused to discuss the experience in detail for several months. When she finally agreed to be interviewed, she stated unequivocally that Leap Castle housed the most negative entity she'd ever encountered. She advised that the Oubliette never be fully excavated or explored, that whatever resided in those depths was best left undisturbed. Sean Ryan, witnessing investigation after investigation, reach similar conclusions, found himself in an unusual position. He owned a castle that credible researchers insisted was genuinely haunted by something dangerous. Tourism interest grew, with people traveling from around the world to see Leap Castle, but the ongoing phenomena created genuine concern for visitor safety. Sean began conducting his own informal observations, documenting patterns in the activity. He noticed that the castle went through cycles of relative quiet followed by intense activity. The triggers weren't always clear, but certain actions seemed to provoke responses. Restoration work near the Oubliette invariably led to increased phenomena. Skeptics who loudly dismissed the stories often became believers within hours. One journalist who'd come to write an expose on gullible ghost hunters spent 20 minutes alone in the bloody chapel before demanding to leave, his article never published. In interviews conducted throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, Sean Ryan's tone shifted from skepticism to reluctant acceptance to something approaching resignation. He acknowledged experiencing phenomena himself on numerous occasions. Unexplained footsteps, voices, overwhelming presences, and yes, the smell. He described the sulfurous stench as the most disturbing aspect, because unlike visual or auditory experiences that could be attributed to imagination or environmental factors, the smell was physical, undeniable, and shared by multiple witnesses simultaneously. The most unsettling aspect of the ongoing activity, according to Sean, was its consistency. Hauntings typically fade over time. Paranormal researchers expect activity to diminish as buildings are restored, as new energy replaces old traumas. Leap Castle defied this pattern completely. If anything, the phenomena intensified as restoration progressed. The entity seemed to resent the intrusion, the human presence that dared to reclaim the space. Sean spoke of feeling tolerated rather than welcomed in his own property, as if the true ownership had never transferred. Modern technology has captured evidence that earlier generations could only describe. Photographs taken in the bloody chapel frequently show shadow figures that weren't visible to the naked eye, dark masses that seemed to absorb light rather than simply blocking it. Audio recordings from the Oubliette area capture sounds that defy identification, including whispers in what some linguists suggest might be archaic Irish, though the words remain untranslatable. Thermal imaging reveals cold spots that move with apparent purpose, approaching investigators before retreating toward the older sections of the castle. Video footage from a 2014 investigation captured what remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence. A locked-off camera positioned to monitor the bloody chapel overnight recorded the temperature dropping from 18 degrees Celsius to near freezing in less than 30 seconds. As the thermal shift occurred, a shadow manifested in the center of the room, growing denser and more defined over the course of several minutes. The shadow appeared roughly human in shape but elongated, distorted, and when it moved, it didn't walk but glided, hovering inches above the stone floor. The entity, if that's what it was, moved directly toward the camera before the feed cut to static. When investigators checked the equipment the following morning, they found the camera had been turned to face the wall, despite being mounted on a tripod and previously aimed at the center of the chapel. Sean Ryan now speaks openly about his belief that Leap Castle houses something genuinely supernatural. He's witnessed too much, documented too many incidents, heard too many consistent testimonies from credible witnesses to maintain skepticism. But he also emphasizes that whatever inhabits the castle isn't simply residual energy or ghostly imprints of past tragedies. The intelligence behind the phenomena demonstrates awareness, intention, and what he describes as a territorial nature that's become more pronounced over time. The entity's apparent protection of the Oubliette suggests something hidden in those depths beyond the skeletons and weapons already discovered. Some researchers speculate that the dungeon might sit atop something older, perhaps a pre-Christian site that drew ancient energies. Others believe the accumulated suffering of the Oubliette's victims created a vortex of negative energy that sustains the elemental. Sean Ryan offers no theories, only observations. When people explore too deeply, ask too many questions, particularly about the Oubliette, the castle responds. And its responses have sent seasoned paranormal investigators running into the night, terrified and convinced they'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. As Leap Castle moves deeper into the 21st century, its reputation as one of the world's most actively haunted locations only grows. The phenomena show no signs of diminishing. If anything, each passing year brings new witnesses, new evidence, and new questions about what truly dwells within those ancient walls. There are places in this world where the fundamental rules seem broken, where the supernatural refuses to behave according to pattern or precedent. Leap Castle's elemental represents one such anomaly, a mystery that deepens rather than clarifies with each passing year. While most spirits and entities attach themselves to specific natural formations, to wells and groves and ancient stones worn smooth by reverence, this creature defies such classification. It exists in stone and mortar, in human construction, in a fortress built for warfare and domination. The question that haunts researchers and sensitives alike remains brutally simple. Why? Traditional wisdom tells us that elementals belong to the earth itself, to places untouched by human ambition. Yet here, in chambers carved by human hands and stained by human violence, something impossibly old makes its dwelling. Some researchers suggest the castle may have been built upon a site already cursed, that the O'Carrolls unknowingly constructed their stronghold atop ground where the veil between worlds had worn dangerously thin. Others propose more disturbing possibilities, whispering of deliberate summonings, of rituals performed in the castle's deepest chambers that called something forth and bound it to the stone. The historical record offers tantalizing fragments, but no answers. The O'Carroll clan ruled with an iron fist, their methods brutal even by the standards of medieval Ireland. But did their practices extend beyond conventional warfare into realms of forbidden knowledge? The family's library, if one existed, has long since turned to ash and memory. Whatever texts they might have consulted, whatever ceremonies they might have conducted in the Oubliette's suffocating darkness, those secrets died with them or were deliberately destroyed. What remains is the creature itself, and the chilling reality that it seems to feed on something the castle provides in abundance. Is it the residual violence, centuries of bloodshed seeping into the very foundations? Or does it draw sustenance from fear itself, from the terror of every visitor who catches that unmistakable scent of decay? Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that it was summoned intentionally, called forth to serve as guardian or weapon, and that it remains because whatever bargain was struck has never been fulfilled or broken. The failure of cleansing rituals presents yet another layer to this deepening mystery. Priests have blessed the halls, mediums have attempted to communicate, energy workers have tried to redirect or dispel the presence. Not only do these efforts fail, they often make matters worse, as if the act of confrontation awakens something better left dormant. The elemental does not respond to prayer or command. It exists beyond such human constructs, operating according to laws we cannot fathom. Even the clearing of the Oubliette, that grim excavation that brought dozens of skeletons into the light, changed nothing fundamental. The remains were given proper burial, the chamber scrubbed and aired, yet it remains the epicenter of activity, the heart of the castle's darkness. Whatever dwells there was not appeased by these gestures toward justice or closure. Current residents have reached an unspoken accommodation with the impossible. They simply avoid certain areas, leaving whole wings of the castle to whatever claims them. This is not surrender born of superstition, but of hard-won experience. Some evils, it seems, are too ancient and too deeply rooted to ever be removed. Leap Castle's elemental may be guarding secrets still buried in its stones, mysteries that will outlast us all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.